rapper was the top nigga, she'll tell you that.
I would never talk to that on my level. She ain't do nothing to me, and she never been in my circle.
In April 2018, the city of Austin, Texas bustled with its usual rhythm. Downtown streets were filled with the sounds of traffic, the chatter of pedestrians, and the constant movement of people navigating the heart of the city. But just beyond the noise of restaurants, offices, and live music venues, another world existed. Outside the Austin Resource Center for the Homeless, known simply as the Arch, life carried a very different tone. For many, it was a place of last resort, a gathering point for those who had no place else to go. It was a center of survival, but also a place where tensions frequently rose, arguments flared, and danger could erupt without warning. On one spring day in April, that danger took form in a way that shocked not only those who witnessed it, but the entire city. A confrontation between two women, both fighting their own battles with hardship and instability, would leave one of them clinging to life and the other facing years behind bars. The women's names were Tiffany Wade and Ishanae Rogers. Neither was a stranger to conflict. Both knew the unpredictability of life on the margins. But what began as a heated exchange on the crowded sidewalks outside the Arch would escalate into a sudden act of violence that could not be undone. Surveillance cameras captured what happened next. At first, it seemed almost ordinary. Two women arguing, one walking away while the other followed. But in a single startling moment, the ordinary became life-threatening. Tiffany Wade lunged forward, a knife in her hand, and struck Ishanae Rogers in the back. Rogers staggered, then collapsed, gasping for air as the wound caused her lung to collapse. Onlookers froze, some shouting, others backing away in shock. Within moments, the scene descended into chaos as people rushed to call for help. Police arrived quickly, guided by witnesses who pointed them to Wade. Paramedics fought to save Rogers, rushing her to a hospital where emergency surgery was the only chance of survival. Against the odds, she lived. But the scars, both physical and emotional, would remain. From that moment forward, the city's attention turned to Tiffany Wade. Was she a violent attacker who struck without reason, or a woman pushed into a desperate act she believed was necessary for her own safety? Investigators, attorneys, and eventually a jury would be forced to answer that question. And at the heart of the case was a piece of evidence that seemed impossible to ignore: the silent, unblinking eye of a camera that recorded every second. Tonight we'll unravel the story of Tiffany Wade and the stabbing of Ishanae Rogers, a case where video evidence clashed with claims of self-defense, and where the outcome would rest on whether the court's believed fear could justify what was seen on screen. If you're drawn to true stories that reveal the complexity of crime, justice, and human behavior, stay with us. And before we begin, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell so you don't miss our next in-depth exploration. To understand the events of April 2018, we must first understand the people at the center of this story and the world in which their lives intersected. The stabbing outside the Austin Resource Center for the Homeless did not happen in isolation. It was the product of two lives shaped by hardship, uncertainty, and an environment where survival often demanded constant vigilance. The Austin Resource Center for the Homeless, or the Arch, stood as a symbol of both help and struggle. For many who passed through its doors, it was a place of refuge, a chance to eat, to sleep, to rest, and to regroup. But for those who lingered outside its walls, the sidewalks became crowded, noisy, and unpredictable. Each day brought together men and women carrying heavy burdens: unemployment, addiction, mental illness, fractured relationships, and a loss of stability. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, and arguments could erupt without warning. The police were no strangers to the area, often called to break up disputes or respond to acts of violence. Among those who spent time around the Arch was a woman named Ishanae Rogers. Rogers was in her 30s, and her life had not been easy. Accounts from those who knew her describe a woman who could be quick-tempered, someone who had been involved in conflicts before. At the same time, she was a survivor, navigating the challenges of homelessness and the unforgiving nature of life on the streets. For Rogers, the shelter was both a necessity and a battleground, a place where her strength was constantly tested. Then there was Tiffany Wade. Also in her 30s, Wade carried her own history of difficulty. Her circumstances had placed her in the same environment as Rogers, where resources were limited and disputes were common. To some, Wade was quiet and reserved. To others, she carried an edge of defensiveness, as though she were always bracing for the next challenge. In the weeks leading up to the incident, Wade had been part of the same community that orbited around the arch, trying to navigate each day without drawing unwanted attention or trouble. But trouble has a way of finding those who are most vulnerable. Both Wade and Rogers were known within that space, and their paths had crossed before. While no one could predict the precise chain of events that would lead to the stabbing, the environment around the arch made conflict almost inevitable. The sidewalks were crowded, space was scarce, and tempers often ran short. It was in this charged atmosphere that the fateful confrontation between the two women began. What started as a verbal dispute on a busy April afternoon would quickly escalate into something far more serious, leaving one woman scarred for life and the other branded a criminal in the eyes of the law. The story of Tiffany Wade and Ishanae Rogers is not just the story of a single crime. It is also the story of two lives shaped by poverty, struggle, and a fragile community where survival often came at a cost. April 2018. The streets outside the Austin Resource Center for the Homeless were crowded as usual. People gathered in small groups, some talking, some pacing, some simply trying to pass the time. In that restless atmosphere, it did not take much for words to turn sharp, for voices to rise, and for a confrontation to draw the attention of everyone nearby. On that day, the confrontation was between two women, Tiffany Wade and Ishanae Rogers. Exactly what sparked the dispute remains uncertain. Some who were present later said the two had exchanged angry words. Others recalled a tense back and forth that seemed to come out of nowhere. But what no one could deny was that the argument escalated quickly. Rogers, visibly upset, began to walk away, leaving the crowded sidewalk behind her. Wade, however, did not let the matter end there. A surveillance camera, mounted high above the street, recorded what happened next. The footage, grainy but clear enough to capture every critical moment, would later become the centerpiece of the entire case. It showed Rogers moving down the sidewalk, her steps hurried, her body turned slightly as though she wanted to be done with the confrontation. Behind her, Tiffany Wade followed. Her movements were deliberate, her eyes locked on Rogers as she closed the distance between them. Then, in one sudden motion, Wade lunged forward. In her hand was a knife. The blade drove into Rogers's back, a single strike that cut deep. Rogers gasped and stumbled, her body twisting as the air rushed from her lungs. The pain was immediate, searing, and life-threatening. She collapsed to the ground, clutching at her side, struggling to breathe. The scene erupted. Shouts filled the air as bystanders froze in disbelief, some backing away, others rushing to help. A few pulled out their phones to call for help. Others pointed directly at Wade, identifying her as the attacker. Wade stood at the center of the chaos, the weapon still in her hand, the confrontation now transformed into something irreversible. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Rogers was pale, gasping, her breath shallow and weak. The knife wound had punctured her lung, causing it to collapse. Without swift medical attention, she would not survive. As paramedics worked frantically to stabilize her, police moved in on Wade. Witnesses gestured in her direction, repeating over and over that she was the one who had struck Rogers. Officers closed in, placing her under arrest. Rogers was rushed to the hospital. There, surgeons fought to repair the damage, performing emergency procedures to re-inflate her lung and save her life. The operation was successful, but the seriousness of the wound left no doubt. This was not a simple fight. It was an assault that could easily have ended in death. Back on the street, the knife was collected, the witnesses interviewed, and the surveillance footage secured. From the very beginning, investigators believed they had a strong case. The stabbing had not happened in the shadows. It had been captured on camera, witnessed by dozens, and followed by a trail of medical evidence that confirmed just how close Rogers had come to losing her life. For Tiffany Wade, The night ended not in freedom but in custody. Her future, once uncertain but still her own, was now firmly in the hands of the justice system. The charge was clear: aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. The question that remained was whether this act was one of aggression, or, as Wade would later insist, an act of self-defense born out of fear. When the stabbing outside the Austin Resource Center for the homeless was over, the scene quickly transformed from chaos to a controlled investigation. Police officers moved through the crowd, separating witnesses, securing the area, and collecting evidence. Tiffany Wade was placed in handcuffs, her face set in a mix of shock and defiance as officers escorted her to a patrol car. Around her, whispers rippled through the crowd, some condemning her, others saying she must have had her reasons. But one fact stood out above all: there was no denying that she had stabbed Ishanae Rogers. Inside the ambulance, Rogers fought for her life. Each breath was shallow, each moment critical. Paramedics worked rapidly, inserting tubes, delivering oxygen, doing everything possible to keep her stable as they sped toward the hospital. The knife had pierced her back with enough force to puncture a lung, leaving her gasping and near collapse. Later, doctors would testify that without immediate surgery, Rogers would not have survived. Meanwhile, detectives arrived at the scene. The knife was recovered, bagged, and logged as evidence. The surveillance footage from the nearby camera was pulled, secured, and reviewed almost immediately. The recording showed everything: Rogers walking away, Wade trailing her, and the sudden thrust of the knife. For investigators, it was powerful evidence. It left little room for interpretation. Witnesses were questioned one by one. Some said they had heard the argument but could not make out the details. Others stated clearly that Rogers had been walking away, that she posed no visible threat at the time she was attacked. One man told officers, "She was leaving. She wasn't even looking back. Tiffany just went after her." Their statements strengthened the prosecution's theory that Wade had been the aggressor and that the stabbing had not been an act of defense but of anger. At the police station, Wade gave her version of events. She claimed she had been afraid of Rogers, that Rogers had a history of starting fights, and that she believed she needed to defend herself. She insisted she had acted out of fear, not out of aggression. Detectives listened but remained unconvinced. With a victim critically injured, a knife recovered, multiple witnesses, and a surveillance video showing the act itself, they believed the case against Wade was strong. News of the stabbing spread quickly through downtown Austin. For many, it was another example of the violence that seemed to hover around the arch. Reporters gathered details, local residents shook their heads, and advocates for the homeless community worried about what the incident would mean for those who depended on the shelter. By the end of the day, the charges against Wade were confirmed. She would face trial for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. Prosecutors prepared their case, confident that the video evidence and eyewitness accounts would lead to a conviction. For Wade, the road ahead was uncertain. She continued to insist she was not the aggressor, that she had acted in self-preservation, but in the eyes of investigators, the story was already written. The investigation had gathered its pieces: a weapon, a victim, witnesses, and a recording that captured the attack frame by frame. Now, the case moved into the courtroom, where a jury would decide whether Tiffany Wade's explanation of fear could stand against the weight of the evidence. When the case of Tiffany Wade moved into the courtroom, it carried with it the weight of undeniable evidence and the heavy burden of unanswered questions. The charge was serious: aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and the courtroom became the stage where her future would be decided. From the very beginning, prosecutors laid out their case with confidence. They pointed to the surveillance video, playing it frame by frame for the jury. It showed Rogers walking away, her back turned, and Wade following closely behind before delivering the sudden strike. Prosecutors argued that this was no act of defense, it was an attack, deliberate and intentional. They emphasized the seriousness of the injury, calling doctors to the stand to describe the collapsed lung, the emergency surgery, and the life-threatening nature of the wound. One physician told the jury, if medical treatment had been delayed even a short while, she might not have survived. Eyewitnesses were called, each recounting what they had seen on the sidewalk that day. Some described the argument, others spoke of Rogers trying to walk away, and nearly all pointed to Wade as the one who escalated the situation. Their voices added weight to the prosecution's claim Tiffany Wade had chosen violence when the confrontation should have ended. But the defense did not remain silent. Wade's attorneys argued that she had acted out of fear, that Rogers had a reputation for being aggressive and violent. They sought to introduce testimony from a woman named Lena Carson, who was prepared to tell the jury that Rogers had started fights and issued threats in the past. Carson's account, they believed, would show that Wade's fear was reasonable, that she had every reason to believe Rogers might harm her. The court, however, would not allow it. The judge ruled that Carson's testimony was inadmissible, declaring that Rogers' reputation was not relevant to what happened in that specific moment on the sidewalk. The defense lost one of its strongest arguments, leaving Wade with little more than her own claim of fear. As the trial unfolded, the atmosphere was tense. The jury watched the footage again and again, their eyes fixed on the movements captured by the camera. The prosecution's narrative was clear, supported by video, witnesses, and medical testimony. The defense's position rested largely on Wade's insistence that she had acted to protect herself. When the jury finally withdrew to deliberate, the question before them was simple yet heavy. Was this self-defense or was it an unprovoked assault? Hours passed before they returned with their decision. Tiffany Wade was found guilty of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. The judge delivered the sentence, 10 years in prison. The courtroom was divided in its reaction. Some nodded in agreement, believing justice had been served. Others shook their heads, convinced that the full truth of Wade's fear had never been heard. But the verdict was final, and Wade's fate was sealed. She left the courtroom not as a woman claiming self-defense, but as a convicted felon bound for a Texas prison. With the verdict delivered and Tiffany Wade sentenced to 10 years in prison, the case did not simply fade from memory. Its aftermath lingered, inside the courtroom, in the community around the Austin Resource Center for the Homeless, and within the appeals process that would follow in the years ahead. For Ishanae Rogers, the physical wounds were severe. The stabbing had left her with a collapsed lung, a condition that required immediate surgery and weeks of recovery. Even after doctors repaired the damage, she faced lasting pain and complications. Breathing became more difficult. Her body carried scars, both visible and hidden, reminders of a single moment that nearly ended her life. Those who knew her spoke of how the stabbing left her more withdrawn, her trust shaken, her health permanently altered. Meanwhile, Wade entered the Texas prison system. To her, the sentence represented not justice, but punishment for something she believed was misunderstood. From the start, she insisted she had acted out of fear. Behind bars, she held to the belief that her trial had been unfair, that the jury had not heard the full truth about Rogers's reputation for violence. Her attorneys began preparing an appeal, determined to argue that the judge's refusal to allow Lena Carson's testimony had denied her the chance at a proper defense. In 2021, 3 years after the stabbing, the case resurfaced in the appellate courts. Wade's legal team argued that Carson's testimony could have changed the jury's perspective. They claimed that if jurors had known about Rogers's past conflicts and aggressive behavior, they might have believed Wade's story of self-defense. The appeal was their last hope to overturn the conviction or at least secure a new trial. But the Court of Appeals rejected the argument. The judges ruled that the trial court had acted properly in excluding the testimony. Reputation evidence, they concluded, could not outweigh what was seen clearly on video: Rogers walking away, Wade following, and the sudden thrust of a knife into her back. The conviction was upheld. Wade's 10-year sentence remained intact. Beyond the courtroom, the stabbing drew renewed attention to the environment around the arch. Residents of Austin voiced concern over the dangers associated with the shelter. Advocates argued that the stabbing was not just about two individuals, but a reflection of deeper systemic failures: mental health struggles left untreated, disputes escalated without mediation, and a city struggling to manage the crisis of homelessness. For some, the case became a reminder that unresolved social issues could erupt into violence at any moment. Theories continued to circulate. Supporters of Wade claimed she was a woman trapped by fear, pushed to the edge in a hostile environment. They believed Rogers's history should have mattered, that Wade's actions, though extreme, were rooted in survival. Others remained firm in the belief that the video spoke for itself, that Wade had chosen to attack, and that her sentence was both just and necessary. In the end, the case of Tiffany Wade and Ishanae Rogers remained more than a story of a single stabbing. It became a reflection of human fragility, of two lives intersecting in a place defined by struggle, and of a justice system tasked with sorting truth from fear when both seemed inseparably entwined. The stabbing of Ishanae Rogers by Tiffany Wade may appear on the surface to be a straightforward story of crime and punishment. A knife, a wound, a trial, and a prison sentence. But beneath those stark facts lay layers of complexity, questions of fear, survival, character, and the very nature of justice itself. For Rogers, survival meant living each day with a body that no longer functioned as it once had. Her collapsed lung was surgically repaired, but the damage lingered. Breathing became a reminder of that night, a shallow ache, a scar pressed into her skin. Beyond the physical injuries, there were psychological ones. For someone already navigating the hardships of homelessness, the attack became a heavy shadow, feeding into feelings of distrust, isolation, and trauma. Wade's story took an entirely different trajectory. She entered the Texas prison system as another inmate with a violent conviction. To some, she was simply a criminal, another case number processed by the courts, but to her family and to the small circle of supporters who believed in her innocence, she was a woman failed by the system, locked away not because of her guilt, but because of rules of evidence and a jury that never heard the whole story. Her appeals, though unsuccessful, revealed the tension at the heart of the justice process. Could someone's past reputation for violence justify an act of preemptive defense? Should testimony about character weigh as heavily as hard evidence captured on video? The courts answered no. The knife, the act, and the timing spoke louder than reputation ever could. And yet, even after the ruling, debate remained among those who followed the case closely. The shelter itself, the arch, became a symbol in the aftermath. Journalists and advocates pointed to the stabbing as proof of a larger crisis in Austin. For years, residents had complained of rising tensions around the shelter, arguments, drug use, and occasional bursts of violence. For those living inside, daily survival was a delicate balance of patience and fear. Rogers and Wade's fight was not unique. It was simply one that ended in blood, making it impossible for the city to ignore. In many ways, this story highlighted the frailty of human control. A simple argument over respect, words exchanged in frustration, spiraled into a violent act that changed two lives forever. One woman carried the wound in her body, the other carried the weight of a conviction in her record. Both were marked. Both were trapped by the consequences of a single night. As the years pass, Wade will eventually leave prison. Rogers, too, continues to rebuild her life, scarred but still alive. Yet the echoes of that night linger. For those who witnessed it, the stabbing became a grim reminder that violence often emerges not in moments of evil, but in moments of fear, desperation, and rage. The case of Tiffany Wade and Ishanae Rogers was more than a courtroom drama. It was a cautionary tale, one that forces us to confront unsettling truths about anger, survival, and the razor-thin line between victim and perpetrator. In the end, justice was delivered, but closure remained elusive.